You know, they say history remembers the faces. It's a powerful idea, right? It makes you think of a story that's, well, pretty familiar.
We see the faces of the heroes.
We recognize the symbols, the flags, the icons. But what if the real story, the most important one, is happening just out of the frame? You know, what about the minds behind those faces, the ones shaping the decisions, calculating the impossible risks?
All right, let's get into it. Because in the shadows of Finland's greatest struggle, there was this man, Erik Heinrichs, a name most of us have probably never heard. And that leads to a huge question we're going to tackle. Was this guy just another officer, or was he the quiet architect of Finland's very survival?
Yeah, he definitely didn't fit the mold of a legend. Forget the dramatic speeches or some larger-than-life personality. Heinrichs was something totally different. Think precise, analytical, and just relentlessly disciplined. He was a mind, not a myth. And you have to understand where he came from. His whole worldview was shaped by instability. I mean, he was born in 1890 when Finland was still part of the Russian Empire. But the real game changer for him? The brutal Finnish Civil War in 1918. That was his baptism by fire, and it taught him a lesson that would define his entire career.
And this right here, this gets to the absolute heart of that lesson. For Heinrichs, war wasn't just chaos, it was a structural problem. It wasn't about who had the most brute force, it was about precise timing. It was this terrifying equation that you had to solve with ice-cold discipline, not just try to endure with emotion. And honestly, the ones who figured that out were the ones who survived.
So, his chance to solve the biggest equation of all came in 1939. The Soviet Union invades, and suddenly Finland, this small northern country, is just staring into the abyss. The Winter War was on.
Now, everyone knows the face of Finland's defense, the national icon, Marshal Mannerheim. But behind him, tucked away in the war rooms, that's where you'd find Heinrichs. As chief of staff, he wasn't chasing headlines. No, he was commanding decisions. He was the one shaping the actual strategy of how they were going to survive this.
So how in the world did they fight back? Finland had no chance in a straight-up conventional war. So Heinrichs helped cook up an unconventional one. See, he understood that the forests, the lakes, the brutal winter, those weren't just obstacles, they were weapons. And this thinking led to the legendary Moti tactics.
Now don't mistake this for just random guerrilla warfare. No, this was a system. Look at the steps. First, you isolate the massive enemy columns with your supermobile ski troops. Then you encircle them, cut them off completely. And finally, you hit them where they're weakest. It was a repeatable process, something they could refine and coordinate. And guess who was at the very center of coordinating that whole system? Yep, Heinrichs.
But, of course, no plan is foolproof, especially when you're facing overwhelming numbers. The Soviet Union started to adapt. They just threw more troops, more tanks, more artillery at the problem. I mean, just imagine the pressure behind a thought like this. Every single decision Heinrichs made, it carried that kind of weight. There were no perfect choices left. There were only consequences.
And then, the breaking point. By early 1940, the defensive lines were cracking. The hope, the illusion that they could hold on forever, it was gone. And this is so important. Heinrichs understood something a lot of others couldn't accept. The only way to actually save Finland was to stop fighting. The goal wasn't victory anymore. It was just survival.
But surviving that war was just the beginning of the story. Because in 1941, war came back. This time, Finland saw a chance, a way to reclaim the territory they'd lost by fighting alongside Germany against the Soviets. But oh man, this was an incredibly dangerous balancing act.
And Heinrichs was a key player in walking this diplomatic and military tightrope. The goal had to be crystal clear. They would fight with Germany, but not for Germany. They had to keep these strict limits on what they would and wouldn't do, because they knew that winning the wrong war could destroy their country just as easily as losing the right one.
But then came 1944, and by then the whole tide of the war had turned completely. The Soviet Union came back, this time with an overwhelming, seemingly unstoppable force. It felt like history was repeating itself, but this time there was absolutely no margin for error. So under this just unbearable pressure, Heinrichs and the rest of the Finnish command had to make every single decision count. Again, the goal wasn't victory. The line just had to hold. It had to hold long enough to buy them time. Time to negotiate, time to survive, and somehow it worked. Finland stayed independent.
Which brings us all the way back to that first question. If this guy was so essential, why is he so often forgotten? Why does history remember the face, the marshal, but not the mind that was right there beside him?
You know, I think the answer is right here, in this contrast. History loves a symbol. It's drawn to the public face of the struggle. But Heinrichs? He was the architect. He wasn't trying to build a legend. He was just building a series of calculated, almost invisible decisions. The kind of stuff that doesn't make for exciting headlines, but it's what actually changes the outcome.
And maybe that's his real legacy. At every single critical moment, he looked at the hard, ugly reality of the situation. He chose the difficult, pragmatic path, the path of survival, over the heroic illusion of a victory that, let's be honest, was never really on the table.